This is a CBS News special report. Campaign 76. Tonight, the final session of the Republican National Convention from the Kemper Arena in Kansas City. This portion is sponsored by Mailgram, impact of a telegram at a fraction of the cost. Now, here is Walter Cronkite.
Good evening, and this is the last night of the Republican National Convention here in Kansas City, the 31st time that this party has met, and tonight it puts the stamp of approval on a ticket that is Gerald Ford, the President of the United States, running for election for the first time, and his choice for the Vice President to run with him, Robert Dole, 53 years old, two-term senator from the state of Kansas, a staunch conservative. The naming of Dole earlier today constituted quite a surprise here in Kansas City. He was not considered to be among those in the final running as the president considered who he wanted to run with him, but that was the announcement earlier today. Tonight we will hear the nominating of Robert Dole, that is the balloting for him. There will be probably one other name mentioned in that balloting, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina, leader of conservative forces. He will have an opportunity because he will be placed in nomination to make one last conservative speech from this platform before the vice presidential acceptance speech of Robert Dole and then the presidential acceptance speech of President Ford himself. Also, in the course of this evening, between those two speeches, Cary Grant, the movie actor, will introduce Mrs. Ford for brief remarks. And now, the opening ceremonies at this last session of the Republican Convention.
The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by a man who addressed this convention on Tuesday. He is a veteran of the Vietnamese War, a prisoner of war for several years, decorated for courage and valor, Colonel Raymond Schrump, a delegate from the state of North Carolina.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a result of my address the other night, I have received a flood of telegrams. I would like to be able to read them all, but there was one that touched me so deeply, I'm going to read it tonight. Sergeant Timothy Bowden, Illinois, missing 3,360 days in Vietnam, and his family thanks you. Only Hanoi knows where I am, dead or alive. My country, America, sent me to Vietnam. Don't let them forget me now. I plead a strong commitment now from the President to locate me and all prisoners of war in absence. Sergeant Timothy Bowden, missing in action, Laos, January the 9th, 1967, by Mrs. Dorothy Bowden, Downers Grove, Illinois. I ask that we make this Pledge of Allegiance in honor of all Americans who, through their personal sacrifices, has made it possible for Old Glory to fly over the home of the brave and the land of the free. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
The national anthem will be sung by that popular entertainer, a delegate from the state of California, Pat Boone. He will be accompanied by Manny Harmon and the Bicentennial Convention Orchestra.
Fellow delegates, and Republicans, brothers and sisters, I imagine we're all a little hoarse from yelling for our candidates last night. I am. But tonight we all have the same candidates, the same party, the same nation, the same anthem. So let's all sing it together with the same kind of enthusiasm we had last night, okay? Manny?
dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bomb bursting in there, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave.
A lot of empty seats here as this session of the Republican convention opens, but it is opening a half hour earlier than the past ones, and also exactly on time, as has every one of these sessions except the first, and that was 3 minutes late. Something of a record for political conventions being established here in Kansas City. The Republican National Convention coverage by CBS News will resume after this message.
May we bring pardon. May we bring union in place of discord. Truth replacing error. Faith where once there was doubt. Hope for despair. Light where there was darkness. Joy to replace sadness. Make us crave not so much to be loved as to love. Use each of us, we pray, as such an instrument in your world today. We are humbly thankful, O God, for our country, for the richness of our resources, for our heritage of freedom.
Pastor Clay Miney of the First Lutheran Church of Mission Hills, Kansas, just begun the invocation.
Those who would govern over us. We do remember before you this night and ask your special blessing for our President, Gerald Ford, for our Vice President, our senators and members of Congress, and for all who are in positions of authority and decision-making. Grant them wisdom and courage to lead and govern with honor and integrity, and with justice and compassion. And we also pray, O God, that upon this convention gathering on this historic occasion, and upon the chosen candidates of this party, and all that will be said and done in the campaign of the weeks and months ahead, that you may add your guidance and your blessing. Amen.
Now that the Republicans have a ticket, let's see what kind of reaction to it our floor correspondents are getting. First, Dan Rather.
Walter, the delegates that I have talked to, and this is a unanimous reaction, are neither happy nor angry with the selection of Bob Dole. Now, when I say unanimous among those delegates with whom I've talked. Time after time, delegation leaders and party powers in their own localities say, look, Bob Dole was picked because he's the least offensive to the most number of Republicans in this hall. All of them express, as of now, some doubt as to whether the ticket, number one, can be elected, and number two, whether it'll help their local candidates. If I could sum up the overall reaction I've heard the most, it is, what do you think of the selection of Bob Dole? I'll look away, never look you in the eye to say, well, okay, but I'm not excited about it. Now to Mike Wallace.
Well, Dan, I'm down here in the Hawaii delegation, and they say, what do you mean Dole isn't a household word? We here in Hawaii hate you for saying that because Dole is on just about every pineapple can in America. The fact is, Dole is not only not a household word, there just is no enthusiasm down here in this quadrant for him. The Northeast states say that he can do nothing, bring them nothing against Carter Mondale. And the Southern states say they wonder if Rogers Morton was right when he said that President Ford was going to write off the Cotton South. What we get down here is mainly bewilderment. They're still trying to sort the thing out. Now to Roger Mudd.
There's no bewilderment here, just a general ho-hum from those states where you would expect the approval, Colorado and Montana and Georgia. There's been approval, nothing electric, but general approval because Mr. Dole is conservative. From those states where you might expect a kickback on this Dole selection, Rhode Island, Wisconsin, Minnesota, there hasn't been much of anything. One Wisconsin delegate said, well, Bob Dole is all right. He'll help us build a party. Now to Mort Dean.
Roger, I just talked with Senator Jacob Javits, the liberal from New York, and I said, will Dole help or hurt in the Northeast? He said he will neither help nor hurt. He said it was a choice President Ford made, probably to get out of this convention unscathed, meaning Dole is neither disliked nor liked by most of the people here. And the senator said that perhaps in the Northeast, people are going to learn that Bob Dole is a bit more sophisticated than many Easterners think he really is, and that might prove to be a positive sign in November. Walter?
There are going to be some other names mentioned as the balloting goes on tonight for the vice presidential nomination, although undoubtedly the president's choice will be respected here. First of all, we mentioned earlier that Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina will be placed in nomination, and that's so that he will have an opportunity to speak from the platform with one final rousing conservative speech. He's the leader of the so-called independent conservatives in the party, was the man who wanted to have Senator James Buckley run for the presidency here, you remember, earlier on in this week. Also, there'll be some sort of votes cast, some in tribute to members of delegations, some perhaps in sort of a complaint over the Dole selection. For instance, we've reported that 2 Arkansas delegates plan to actually vote for Senator Helms, although he will withdraw his name officially from consideration after he makes his speech, we're told. One delegate intends to vote for Senator Schweiker for vice president. That was Reagan's choice, you know. There are some West Virginia delegates, or some Virginia delegates, who plan to vote for Senator William Scott of Virginia in tribute to his work in the delegation. That sort of thing probably will go on. One thing that has happened here today, we should bring you up to date from earlier this morning, 2:30 this morning as a matter of fact. The draft Reagan movement, which the Florida delegation particularly worked on throughout the night, has apparently collapsed, mostly because Ronald Reagan, although he left the door open for that, said later on in the day he definitely would not accept the draft. They're introducing the Cabinet of the United States now from the podium, and let's go to that podium.
Simon. The Secretary of Defense and Mrs. Rumsfeld.
Secretary of State Kissinger was introduced first. He got a round of applause. The hall is not anywhere near filled. Perhaps a fourth of the delegates and almost none of the spectator seats are filled. Introduced now William Simon. Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld.
The Attorney General and Mrs. Levy. The Secretary of the Interior and Mrs. Pleppy. The Secretary of Agriculture, Mrs. Earl Butts. The Secretary of Commerce and Mrs. Richardson. The Secretary of Labor and Mrs. W.J. Ussery. The Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, David Matthews. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and Mr. Hills. The Secretary of Transportation, and Mrs. William Coleman. Counselor and Mrs. Robert Hartman. Director of the Office of Management and Budget, James Lynn.
These members.
Counselor to the President, John Marsh.
These members of the cabinet and of the official White House staff are up in the glass enclosed booths, and there you can see them now.
And Mrs. William Scranton.
It's difficult to get light on them so that they could be seen at all. You can't see much of them as it is. As you see there, that's Elliot Richardson of Commerce and Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture. Looks like Senator Tower down in front of them. It is Senator Tower of Texas, down there in the lower left-hand side of your picture. There he is. He was going to be the floor manager for President Ford here until he didn't get elected a delegate from Texas in that Reagan sweep of the state. Eric Severide and Bill Moyers have some thoughts about this Republican ticket.
Well, mine aren't very original thoughts. I don't know if Bill's are. I would guess that one big consideration must have been to find somebody, the vice president here, who would finesse any possibility of a draft Reagan movement. Connolly could have done that, but he didn't want to go to Connolly. Dole may not unify them a great deal, but he doesn't disunify them any further, would you think, Bill?
Not at all, and he also brings to the ticket something that Gerald Ford doesn't have, which is a combativeness to go after Jimmy Carter. Dole is a practitioner of the brass rule of politics, Eric. It's do it unto others before they do it unto you. He almost got beat in his re-election campaign in 1974 because he'd been so closely associated with Richard Nixon as chairman of the Republican National Committee. He took off the gloves, ran the most effective advertising campaign, attacked the Democrats, and won by 2 points. That's the kind of fighter he is.
In many ways, a remarkable fellow. This is a true war hero. This is a man who lay in hospital during and after the war for over 3 years, I think, terribly wounded. Done it all on his own. Man of great confidence. He'd be quite a campaigner. I would think that he would occupy in the campaign the relationship to Ford that Richard Nixon had to Eisenhower in '52. Nixon did the rough and tumble work while Ford took the higher road, and Mr. Nice Guy, Eisenhower did, which Ford will do this time. Somebody's got to go after Jimmy Carter hard. That's what they want to do. They think they can puncture a lot of his balloons, his air of righteousness, or what they think are his inconsistencies. And they want to do that. They've been talking about Carter in this convention as though Carter were the incumbent they're trying to unseat. So they've got to change that. They've got to get on a positive note. And, of course, go after the Democratic Congress, which is what they'll do.
They'll have to do more than simply attack, however. If you look at the figures, at the way Richard Nixon won in 1972, he cut very heavily into the old Democratic coalition. He took the South. He took 51% of the blue-collar vote. He took over half of the Catholic voters and a third of the Jewish voters. And you have to ask, can two Midwestern Republicans from rural areas, in effect, small towns, repeat those gains that Nixon made in 72?
Very big question. We're a bit pressed. We'll give it back to the anchor room, Walter Cronkite.
We are about to get the balloting for the nominations, the roll call for nominations for the vice presidential balloting here on the floor of the convention. The chairman of the convention, John Rhodes, the congressman and House Minority Leader from Arizona, is explaining the rules of the roll call, and we might listen in for that because immediately following that the roll call begins. Back to the podium.
President shall not exceed 15 minutes. When the names of candidates have been placed in nomination, the chair will ask the secretary to call the roll of states for the purpose of voting. Under Rule 16 of the convention, once the secretary has begun to call the roll, it cannot be dispensed with for any reason. Therefore, all states will be called. If any state desires to pass at this time, it may, of course, do so. At the conclusion of the first call of the roll, the secretary will proceed to call the names of those states which passed. No delegation will be recognized to change its vote until all delegations which have passed have been given a second opportunity to vote. This is in accord with Rule 18B. Finally, and I hope you will listen to this because there was some confusion about it last night.
While we listen to the rules, Dan Rathers with Senator Jesse Helms, whose name will be placed in nomination later tonight. Dan?
Senator Helms, how did this happen? How was the decision made that your name would be placed in nomination?
Well, I didn't make it, that's for sure. It sort of crept up on me, and it's nothing to it, really. Just
well, you will get some time up at the microphone. That's the most important thing. What are you going to say, in essence?
Well, I think I better wait. It's about 2 minutes worth, and I wrote it in the car coming, so
let me tell you
Let me have one surprise.
One surprise. One member of the...
I don't think I'm going to surprise you, Dan Riley.
Well, one member of your delegation, the North Carolina delegation, said, quote, what he's going to do is give the liberals in this party hell, unquote. Is that true?
Well, that may be some slight exaggeration.
Do I understand the plan correctly?
I don't give anybody that. I just tell the truth, and they think it's that, you know.
Now, do I understand the plan correctly? Your name's going to be placed in nomination, and as soon as you speak, then it'll be withdrawn.
Well, let's wait and see.
Walter, Senator Jesse Helms.
Okay, they're just beginning to call the roll of the states. Here it goes. I might point out that there is also a report that Jesse Helms, in that speech, will call for unity in that brief speech, as well as perhaps get a couple of last conservative licks in.
Please take your seats. We are about to proceed with a roll call of the states for the purpose of the nomination of the next Vice President of the United States. It would be appreciated if all delegates would be in their seats, and only those persons in the delegate section who are entitled to be there, either delegates or persons who are sitting in as alternates or other qualified individuals under the rules of the convention. Now, if you will please take your seats, be quiet, and listen to the secretary as she calls the roll of states.
Yes. Alabama.
Madam Secretary, due to an accident on the road at which it had the traffic detained, our bus bearing most of our delegation has not arrived yet. So the state of Alabama passes.
Alaska.
Madam Chairman, the great state of Alaska would like to yield to the great state of New York.
Arizona.
Madam Chairman, the great state of Arizona and the home state of our permanent convention chairman and secretary at this time passes.
Arkansas. Madam Chairman, Arkansas passes. California.
Madam Chairman, California passes.
Colorado.
Mr. Chairman, Colorado passes.
Connecticut.
Madam Secretary, Connecticut passes.
Delaware.
Madam Secretary, Delaware passes.
The District of Columbia. The District of Columbia. The District of Columbia. Florida.
Madam Secretary, Florida passes.
Georgia.
Georgia passes.
Guam.
Madam Secretary, the beautiful island of Guam passes.
Hawaii.
Oh, Hawaii passes.
Idaho.
Madam Secretary, state of Idaho passes.
Illinois. Illinois.
Illinois passes.
Well done.
Indiana.
Madam Chairman, Indiana passes.
Iowa.
Iowa passes.
Kansas.
Madam Secretary, may I inquire as to whether the state of Alaska yielded to New York? In that case, Kansas passes, but will be heard from later.
Thank you. Kentucky.
Madam Chairman, Kentucky passes.
Louisiana.
Madam Chairman, Louisiana passes.
Maine.
Madam Secretary, Maine passes.
We'll be back in 1 minute with more CBS
Madam
News
Secretary,
coverage of the Republican
Madam
National
Secretary,
Convention.
a delegate from Maryland has a nomination.
Montana passes. Nebraska.
Madam Secretary, Nebraska passes.
Nevada.
Madam Secretary, Nevada passes.
New Hampshire. New Hampshire.
Madam Secretary, New Hampshire passes.
So, Mary Crisp, Mrs. Mary Crisp of Arizona, Secretary of the
Madam
Convention,
Secretary,
continues to call the roll. Most of the states are passing. Of course, we know how it is all going to come out. We believe with the nomination of Robert Dole and a momentary nomination to be withdrawn for Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. Bruce Morton on the podium can explain the nomination procedure to us. Bruce?
Walter, there's almost nothing to explain. Getting nominated for president under Republican rules is complicated. It takes majority support from a total of 5 states. Getting nominated for vice president doesn't take anything except one delegate and one delegation who wants to nominate you, one candidate who wants to be nominated. That means that anybody can run just about, and people run for all sorts of reasons, usually simply, if they're not the president's choice, that is, because they want to make a speech. That's apparently the case with Senator Helms tonight. While we were away on that last commercial, Maryland said it had a nomination to make. We assume that will be the Helms nomination, and that the Maryland delegate involved is the conservative congressman from Maryland's Eastern Shore, Richard Bauman. In any case, nominations are simple, as I say. There are really no rules. The nominees get a chance to speak, make their point, gracefully withdraw, and the voting is, for all practical purposes, fixed. Walter?
As we continue this call of the roll to see whether they have a name to put in nomination or not, come up with a rather interesting bit of research by Chris Kelly on the vice presidential choice by President Ford. What he finds is that when Senator Dole was having his uphill fight here in Kansas a couple of years ago for re-election against Dr. Bill Roy, and looked like he was going to lose. All of the polls showed that Roy was way ahead. At that time, Senator Dole was on our CBS television program, Face the Nation, and he was asked if he thought that the Watergate and ensuing things had any bearing upon the election and the fact that he was running behind, and Senator Dole said, "I think so." He was asked specifically, was President Ford an issue? And he said, "I think so." He said that Kansas Republicans had been encouraged when Mr. Ford first took office, but, and these are his words, along came the pardon of former President Richard Nixon and amnesty for Vietnam War draft evaders and deserters. I really don't need any more help of that kind before November. Senator Dole said of President Ford, the man who's now selected him as his running mate in the 1976 campaign. The chairman is calling for order.
And will you please not impede the progress of the convention? The delegate from Utah.
Utah.
Well, Madam Secretary, I see no progress being made in this aisle.
Vermont.
Madam Secretary, in honor of the birthday of United States Senator George D. Aiken, the state of Vermont passes.
Virginia.
Madam Secretary, the Commonwealth of Virginia passes.
The Virgin Islands.
Madam Secretary, the Virgin Islands passes.
Washington.
Madam Secretary, Washington passes.
West Virginia.
West Virginia passes.
Wisconsin.
Madam Secretary, Wisconsin passes.
Wyoming.
Wyoming passes.
The District of Columbia.
District of Columbia passes.
Utah.
Well, Madam Secretary, there's still no progress on this aisle, but Utah passes.
Thank you. This, Mr. Chairman, concludes the calling of the roll.
The state of Alaska having yielded to the state of New York, the chair now recognizes the chairman of the delegation from the state of New York to place a name in nomination for the office of Vice President of the United States.
That's Richard Rosenbaum, the chairman of the New York delegation. He will introduce Vice President Rockefeller, who will be the man who will actually place Senator Dole's name before the convention. The seconding speeches will come from Peggy Pinder. We saw an interview with her just a night or two ago. She's a blind,
May I please have
young
the
blind
attention of
delegate
the
from
New York
Grinnell, Iowa.
delegation?
Quite a person. Then Art Fletcher, former Undersecretary of Labor, and Senator Paul Laxalt, who nominated Reagan for president, was chairman of his
Our phone
campaign.
is plugged in, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman,
gentleman is
approaching the
recognized.
podium is a great leader of our party, a man whose distinguished service to the Republican Party, to the state of New York, and to America has earned him an enduring place of high honor in the history of our country. New York's favorite son, for the purpose of nominating another great American, I present to you the greatest Vice President of the United States, the dynamic and honorable Nelson A. Rockefeller.
Incidentally, if there are any Alabamians tuned in who are concerned about that announcement that the Alabama delegation bus had been in an accident and delayed the arrival of the delegation here, we checked up on that right away here at CBS News, and it turns out that there was no accident. The bus was simply delayed in traffic. And the Alabama delegation's quite all right and is now, I assume, arriving at the hall. Nelson Rockefeller, Vice President of the United States, longtime Governor of New York, will put into nomination the name of Senator Robert Dole, the 53-year-old two-time conservative senator from Kansas, who is Gerald Ford's choice as the man to run with him in 1976 against the Democratic ticket. Nelson Rockefeller took himself out of consideration for the vice presidency last fall, as you'll remember. It was a bid to help unify the party behind President Ford. At that time, there already was strong pressures being built up in the conservative ranks. This was before it was known whether Ronald Reagan would enter the race or not. For Rockefeller to be dumped, as well as Secretary of State Kissinger. Rockefeller bowed out in what was considered to be a bid to keep Ronald Reagan from entering the race at all. It failed, partly because perhaps Kissinger himself stayed in. And indeed, Secretary of State Kissinger has been a target of the Reagan and the conservative forces here since this convention began. They got a minority report in the platform that indirectly criticizes Secretary Kissinger and the Ford administration's policies on détente and other associations with the Soviet Union, particularly the Helsinki Declaration on Human Rights, and what they considered the administration's snub of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Soviet author and who was thrown out of his own country, exiled last year. When he came to the United States, the White House did not receive him, it was reported at the time, because Kissinger had advised it might upset Moscow. The man who Nelson Rockefeller will place in nomination in a moment, Robert Dole, has a strong conservative record. He could hardly have picked a more conservative senator. Americans for Democratic Action last year, which rates the senators on the basis of their votes on key issues, gave him only a 17 rating. The Americans for Conservative Action the year before had given him an 84 rating, about as high as you can get. But last year dropped him because of a couple of votes they didn't like, down to 67 rating. COPE, the labor political organization, gave him a 24 rating last year and 18 the year before. Our research shows that among his most conservative positions have been those on tax reform.
Fellow delegates, ladies and gentlemen, one of the great Republicans of all time, the Vice President of the United States, Nelson A. Rockefeller.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Delegates to the convention. Turn up the mic. Delegates to the convention, fellow Americans. Last night in this hall, the Republican Party made history. First, it endorsed the solid achievements of the first person ever to hold the office of President of the United States by appointment. The man who brought this nation successfully through one of the gravest constitutional crises, Gerald R. Ford. Second, in the spirit of spirited contest, it showed everyone how in our society a political party can choose its standard bearer by open balloting with the world watching. Third, it showed how the contest was resolved. The contenders could meet afterwards with mutual respect and goodwill and pledge their joint efforts for the party and for the nation. I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, where else in the world would the winner go to call on the runner-up? And in how many places in the world would he be received by the runner-up at all? Much less be greeted so graciously as was Gerald Ford last night by Ronald Reagan. When we came here, it was my hope, and I believe the hope of most Americans, that out of this convention would come a reunited, reinvigorated Republican Party. A party determined to meet the nation's problems with new solutions, grounded on historic American principles. A giant step was taken in that direction last night. Tonight, we take another such step. For tonight, we choose a running mate for our presidential candidate. And for that, we need to choose, first and foremost, a person who could serve as president if, God forbid, the president himself could no longer serve. Secondly, a person who is devoted to the principles of the Republican Party and not only the fundamental principles of our American system of government, but also the principles of our unique enterprise system, to our personal liberty and our individual economic freedoms. Third, a person who can be a partner of our president and our presidential candidate in this election and an aid to our president in the discharge of his duties. You and I know such a man. If emergency required, he could serve as our chief executive, for he knows the ways of government. He has served local government as a county attorney for 4 years. He has served his state as a legislator. He has served in the federal government, first elected as a member of the House of Representatives, serving for 8 years, and thereafter elected as a senator, a United States senator, now serving in his second term. He knows our economic system. He has served in 2 of the most important committees of the Senate, the new Budget Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. I'm going to turn up the mic. They can't hear. I'm going to turn up the mic. This podium and that mic won't go up. You better turn them up. He understands the complexities of modern economic life. He never loses sight of what really makes our enterprise system tick. He knows what it takes to have a healthy farm economy. He knows how vital America's farm families and their productivity are to feeding the world. He knows that our founding fathers did not ordain that all wisdom should be derived from the District of Columbia. But that the great driving force of this nation was to be found in the common people of America, in their cities, in their hometowns, and their farms, in our individual enterprise system, in our voluntary efforts. He has lived this knowledge not only in his public life, but in his civic associations, his professional activities, and in his philanthropic causes. He is a person of compassion. He has never forgotten the sacrifices of others, our Vietnam POWs, the families of our men missing in action, the handicapped who have no greater champion. He knows, too, how precious is the gift of freedom. He knows that every generation of Americans must secure that freedom again and again by its own sacrifices. He has lived this knowledge, too, through 5.5 years of combat in World War II, twice wounded and twice decorated for heroic achievement. He has that quality of candor, of openness, of forthrightness, so needed in our times, in the executive posts of our government, in the legislative process, and in our political campaigns and our political candidates. He is able, articulate, courageous, and decisive. He is a man who can pass the test once put up by that great and beloved Missourian from Independence who said so aptly, "If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen." The man of whom I speak can take the heat, ladies and gentlemen. And if you ask those of us who really know him, he can not only take it, believe me, he can really dole it out. I have the honor to nominate as the Republican candidate for the Vice Presidency of the United States the distinguished son of Kansas, Senator Robert J. Dole.
CBS News coverage of the Republican National Convention will continue in a moment.
CBS News continues its special report, Campaign 76. Tonight, the final session of the Republican National Convention from the Kemper Arena in Kansas City. This portion is sponsored by the people of Ford Motor Company on behalf of Ford and Lincoln Mercury dealers. Ford wants to be your car company. Now here again is Walter Cronkite.
There's a modest demonstration for the choice of President Ford as his running mate. Robert Dole, senator from Kansas, has just been placed before the convention by Nelson Rockefeller, the vice president, the current vice president. But this demonstration certainly is nothing like those raucous and even rambunctious ones last night for Ford and for the man who came so close to unseating him, Ronald Reagan. Sunflowers from the state of Kansas. This demonstration is not scheduled to go on anything like any of those last night. The Ronald Reagan demonstrations in 3 sections lasted an hour and 10 minutes. Whether they would go into the record books if they'd gone to an hour 20, since they were in 3 sections or not, we don't know. But that is the record. For William Jennings Bryan, back at the turn of the century, one of his demonstrations went an hour and 20 minutes. Now we're going to get seconding speeches, one from Peggy Pinder, quite brilliant blind delegate from Grinnell, Iowa.
Peggy Pinder, who will second the nomination of Senator Robert Dole. Peggy.
I have attended 2 national conventions this summer, primarily concerned with championing the rights of people. I have attended 2 national conventions this summer primarily concerned with championing the rights of people. The first was the convention of the largest organization of blind people in this country, the National Federation of the Blind. The second is this convention of the Republican Party. As a blind person, I have long been aware of Senator Dole's support of the aspirations of the blind and other disabled and disadvantaged people in their efforts to become fully participating members of society. The Senator's own life and his efforts on behalf of the disabled and other minorities in federal, legislative, and executive work show that he seeks for the blind and for all others what the Federation's president, Dr. Kenneth Jernigan, calls not charity, but opportunity, not sympathy, but understanding. Senator Dole has led the way in urging the establishment of a barrier-free environment so that all people can participate fully in all aspects of life. The Senator knows that people should be accepted for what they can do and not for what they can't do. He knows that the most severe handicaps facing many minorities are not only the physical barriers, but the attitudes and prejudices that people have. His insistence that he be accompanied by an interpreter for the deaf is an example of his continuing awareness of the barriers between us. I am proud this evening to be able to second the nomination of a man whose life and words so emphatically affirm the American tradition of equal opportunity for all, Senator Robert Dole.
Peggy Pinder is 20 years old. She's from Iowa. She graduated this spring, Phi Beta Kappa, magna cum laude from Cornell College in Mount Vernon, Iowa, and she's going to enter as a freshman in the freshman law class at Yale in September. She became blind in her freshman year in high school at Grinnell. Her father, Al Pinder, is the editor-publisher of the Grinnell Herald Register, and Peggy had written a letter to President Ford that her father delivered to the President at the White House during a press meeting in Washington last March. She became a delegate to this convention in a Ford booster. Senator Dole has an outstanding record for his aid to the handicapped. As you know, earlier in the convention, when he made his speech upon being named temporary chairman of this convention, he had his speech translated for the deaf on television. For some reaction to this Dole selection, Mort Dean talked to the president of the Ripon Society. That's a liberal Republican group.
Glenn Gerstel in tow just a few moments ago, and he went down the aisle and has been unable to come back, but the ultra-liberal Ripon Society of the Republican Party has been passing this around to the delegates, and it says the selection of Senator Bob Dole as the president's running mate is disappointing because while it unifies the conservative elements of the GOP, It ignores the moderates in the party who were responsible for Ford's nomination. It does not offer an alternative, but just expresses dissatisfaction with Senator Dole. Walter?
Thank you, Morton. Dole, of 38 Republican senators, 14 only are rated more conservative than Dole by the American Conservatives, Americans for Conservative Action. Of the entire Senate, that's 100 members, 75 members are rated more liberal, according to the Americans for Democratic Action, the liberal group. Senator Paul Laxalt has just been introduced as a seconder for Senator Dole, and he's getting quite a demonstration, particularly from the Reagan forces. He was the man who placed Reagan's name in nomination for the presidency. He was chairman of Citizens for Reagan. He's a first-term senator from Nevada. That's the Texas delegation, which has been most vociferous in support of Ronald Reagan, with the cheer that they've been giving frequently during these demonstrations. Now, Senator Paul Laxalt.
My fellow delegates, you know, we may not have won, but we fought a good fight. Let me say first that the Ford-Dole ticket has the enthusiastic support of Governor Reagan and I. And I'd like to personally compliment President Ford in making an excellent choice in selecting Bob Dole to run with him. Bob was a